So we're using useContext to pass the isLoggedIn state to my other components here. That's great, but of course you will notice that we're still forwarding the onLogout prop or the logout handler function through props, and that's of course still not ideal. It would be nicer if we could use the main header like this, so without passing any data to it, because we don't need to forward onLogout. But of course at the moment this would not work. This would mean at the moment that we're simply not able to log out because we're not passing our logout handler. So hammering the logout button here in the navigation wouldn't do anything. The good thing is we can set up a dynamic context where we don't just pass data to our components, but also functions, which technically of course also is data, but still you get my point. Here all we need to do is in our auth context provider, where we set up the value, besides passing down isLoggedIn, we can also pass down, let's say, onLogout, where we point at the logout handler. Just like this. If I do that, and make sure you don't execute it, you just want to point at the function. If I do that, then every listening component, every component that listens to auth context will be able to utilize logout handler here, simply through the onLogout context value. So therefore, back in navigation, where we are referring to props onLogout, we can now simply do ctx onLogout. And this will work because on the context object, we now have the onLogout value. So if we save that, now logging out works again. And of course, the rest of the app also works just fine, as you can tell. So this now all works, again, with the help of context, where you can not just pass down values like strings, objects, and so on, but where you can also pass down functions. And therefore, now we're using this app-wide or component-wide context object to manage our state and to manage the function that changes the state. Hence, we don't need props in the navigation component anymore. And we can remove it. And you now have a great example for using context. Now here, in my main section here, I will still pass down the logout handler through onLogout and the login handler through onLogin, because I directly use those handlers in the login and home components. You see in the login component, we directly refer to props onLogin. We're not forwarding it, we're using it here. And the same in the home component. I'm directly using onLogout here. Sure, we're technically forwarding it to our own button component, but this is a pure presentational component. And this here is actually fine. I don't want to use context inside of my button to always bind button clicks to onLogout, because whilst this would remove the need to pass onLogout like this, it would also mean that our button is now always logging the user out and not able to do anything else upon a click. And this also shows you when to use props and when to use context. In most cases, you will use props to pass data to components, because props are your mechanism to configure components and to make them reusable. Only if you have something which you would forward through a lot of components and you're forwarding it to a component that does something very specific, like for example the navigation, where this button will always log the user out. In such cases, you want to consider context. And as with everything in programming, with more experience, it will also of course become clearer and more natural when to use what. You can of course always rely on prop chains if you prefer that, but context allows you to write more concise code, and it often makes managing such app-wide state simply a bit easier.